what a journey. You know, life's a journey. We come into being, we go out of being. And it's easy for me to say it like that. But in our journey from being to life, to consciousness, to self-awareness, there's this one place that became so evident the moment human beings woke up. In the Garden of Eden, the ancients tried to talk about it. We ate off of two trees, the tree of good and bad and the tree of life and death. We became aware of our own demise, and we realized that what made us live was good and what killed us was bad. You know, it's been said, and I think this is from the annals of Judaism, that there is no greater fear than to love what death can touch. Within this human experience, there is no place where anguish is greater than in the loss of those we love. This is an important piece. It's a somber and sincere and serious piece. Death is inevitable, yet the timing of it, the effect it has on those of us still living, is the deepest and most overwhelming visceral experience human beings can have. If you don't know this feeling, bless you. But most have some sense of it. It's this place of loss. Now, I have my two cohorts here, Bob Hayes coming from Florida, Mary Ann from down in Spokane Valley. I'm up on the South Hill in Spokane, Washington. And Mary Ann's getting ready to present a TED Talk. And it's basically what our subject is this podcast, and that is grief and growth. What do we do with this grief? How do we make something good from it? And so today, Mary Ann has agreed to share her TED Talk, which is going to be on Saturday, and kind of try it out on us. And of course, Mary Ann's journey of loss is great for those of you who've been following, but I'll let her speak for herself. And on that note, Mary Ann, in all blessings, I turn the comm over to you.
Hey, I'm just going to jump right in. So, according to the Recovery Village, there are approximately 2.5 million people who die in the United States every year, and they leave behind an average of 5 grieving people. So that's 12.5 million newly grieving people each year. Chances are really good that either you or someone you care about is grieving a loss right now. Grief is really hard for us to talk about, and I think it's because it makes us feel so powerless. We have absolutely no control over life and death, and yet we do have control over how we approach life and how we understand death. I've been living with grief for over 25 years, and I knew that if I was ever going to feel real joy again, I was going to have to learn a new way to understand life. My daughter Nikki was diagnosed with cancer when she was 16 months old. I was pregnant with my second child, Michael, at the time, and my third child, Matthew, was born just after she finished treatments 2 years later. When a child's diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, there's a different kind of grieving that occurs. My husband and I grieved the loss of our healthy child. We grieved the loss of certainty. We didn't know if she was going to grow up. And we did learn a new appreciation for how fragile life really is. Ultimately, she did survive. And after her treatments, we moved on and life became relatively normal. But as most of us know, normal is an illusion. And just 3 years later, my husband Kerry was diagnosed with cancer. He was 34 years old. I was convinced that he was going to live. After all, Nikki survived. He was convinced that he was going to die. And he told me it was because when Nikki was sick, he had prayed for God to take the cancer from her and give it to him. He wanted to save his daughter. And so when he was diagnosed, he felt like his prayer had been answered. He found meaning and purpose in his suffering. But then, because life is rarely what we think, a year into his treatments, Nikki was diagnosed with a secondary cancer, and she was going to need a bone marrow transplant to survive. The meaning and purpose that Kerry thought he had found seemed to have been lost. He learned that you cannot exchange one life for another. It just doesn't work that way. So in the last year of his life, he and Nikki walked each other through cancer treatments. And then when Nikki relapsed after her bone marrow transplant, it also became apparent, to paraphrase spiritual teacher Ram Dass, that they were walking each other home. Carrie died in April of 1994. Nikki was out of treatment options. And so as much as we wanted to just stop and grieve, we knew that her days were numbered. And really, all of us have numbered days, even if we don't know what that number is. So she just wanted to be a kid. So in the shadow of her father's death and with her death imminent, Nikki taught us how to embrace life. We hiked the redwoods, and we joked that it was with her on my shoulders most of the time. We ate Chinese food in Chinatown in San Francisco. We went and visited relatives in Ohio. She got to go swimming with her brothers, something she hadn't been able to do for the last year because of her treatments. And then just 4 months after her dad, Nikki died. Again, as much as I wish that life would just stop, it doesn't. And we needed to move as well. So on New Year's Eve of 1994, we moved to Spokane, Washington. It was against the conventional advice of making any major changes so soon after such a loss, but it was the right decision for us. We started our new lives in the new year in our new home. And we started the long road of grief, of healing, and with grief counseling and lots of tears. And I began to search to try and understand why suffering exists. I discovered Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So Frankl is a Holocaust survivor. And he said that even in hopeless situations, we can turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. And knowing the horrors that he had been through, these words shifted something in me. I remember the first Mother's Day after Carrie and Nikki passed, and I just wanted to pull the covers over my head as I was laying in bed. And my boys came running and laughing into my room, shouting, "Happy Mother's Day." And I remember that was the first time that I fully felt joy and sorrow simultaneously. When grief took me to the depths of sorrow, I also discovered that I had an equal and expanded capacity for joy. But again, life was going to show me that it had its own plans. And those words of Viktor Frankl were going to be tested even more. Because 3 years after moving to Spokane, Michael was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He was 10 years old. I told myself that he was going to survive. But that isn't what happened. He died 2 years later at the age of 12. And I truly believe that Carrie and Nikki welcomed him home. When Michael died, the depth of my grief felt bottomless. It was like nothing I had already experienced. There's life can teach us, nature has a way of teaching us about life. And there's a symbiotic relationship between fire and the giant sequoia trees in Northern California. Every 10 to 20 years, fires sweep through the forest and they burn away the brush on the ground. The thick barks of the trees protect them from burning, but the heat rises to the cones at the top. And the cones expand and they drop seeds to the newly cleared ground. New life begins because of the destructive force of fire. And I began to imagine that maybe the grief that was burning through my life could open me up to new ways of understanding life. I had a choice to make about what to do with this powerful force of grief that was just burning through my life. I could live the rest of my life in anger and despair and sorrow, or I could choose to allow these things to open me up to a new understanding of life. I don't know why these things happened. And I do know that I can say that the choices that I had to make were the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm not at all saying that the new growth that I could experience was worth the pain and sorrow, but these things were out of my control. The losses I couldn't do anything about. What was in my control was what I chose to do with this grief. And that was and continues to be my choice. But there are no shortcuts in life, and you don't get over grief. My life was never going to go back to the way it used to be. When someone we love dies, our lives are changed forever. And I needed to allow myself the time that I needed, and not the time that others thought I needed, in order to integrate these losses into my life. Grief is a solitary journey, but the paradox is we can't do it alone. I had supportive friends and family, and I found community of other bereaved parents who really understood the depth of my sorrow. I talked with others who had lost their spouse, and it made me feel like I wasn't alone, that I wasn't being singled out for this affliction. I learned to embrace my life the way it is, rather than the way I was taught that it was supposed to be. We're told over and over that children should not die before their parents, that it's against the natural order, that young mothers and fathers should not die before they get to see their children grow up. And it made me feel like there was something wrong with my life. And yet, who says that this is the natural order? Life is a mystery, and these things happen much more than we care to admit. My life is not wrong because it didn't turn out the way I had planned. I don't know why my husband died at 36, my daughter at 9, and my son at 12. But I do believe that Carrie, Nikki, and Michael lived their lives fully because that is how many years they were here. And I'm grateful for every one of those years. Love doesn't die. It continues in new and different ways. Grief is not a permanent and static state. It's going to ebb and flow throughout our lives as long as we live. We can consciously learn to live in a symbiotic relationship with grief and allow it to open up new growth in us. It will be hard, but the one thing that I can promise is that it will be worth the effort. Because really, in the end, we are all just walking each other home. Thank you.
Wow. Amen. And I'll tell you what, can't think of two people I love more to walk me home. Thank you. But you know, Marianne, as you're speaking, you unlock a lot of pieces of my own losses, and they connect. And when you said, you have to do grief alone, and yet the paradox is that says something about human consciousness that is good and wholesome.
And I know I totally stumbled a bit. I've still got some more work to do before Saturday, but I did forget some parts that I hope to include on Saturday. But thank you for that, though. Yeah.
I mean, what you're talking about here is universal, and you're bringing your specifics to it that bring the universal home to us in a way that is both, it sucks and it's a really wonderful thing that shows our connection. And I think that's the piece that keeps shining for me, is the connection. It's almost like the depth of my loss is a measure of my connection to that person. And that's meaningful. And I think the root question, metaphysical question, is why suffering exists.
Yeah. Yeah, I spent a lot of time on that one.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Still
Bob.
do.
Yeah.
You know, Marianne, my reaction is so wide and so deep. Your honesty is just impressive. Your ability to move forward and take others with you is, I mean, you are a hero. And I wouldn't worry about forgetting something or stumbling over your words or whatever. That doesn't matter. The truth that you're conveying is so strong and so meaningful that everything else pales in comparison. And the months that we have spent together in the deep end have been so important to me, and you have been so important in the things that I've learned. How you take it upon yourself to realize that your life is in your control. How you react to whatever comes is yours to control. And that is really, really inspirational. And I want to thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk immensely.
Amen.
Thank you, Bob. That means, I'll tell you what, it means a lot from both of you. Yeah, thank you.
And you know, this is a very intimate place in the human experience. And we've talked about the deep end is not about providing answers, but about waking up to the mystery and feeling at home in that place. Even though being at home in that place is full of anxiety and all kinds of other things, if we dare to be open to the fullness of what it is. And we've taken you through a journey. And here in this place in our journey, Marianne lists some huge metaphysical things. One, life is fragile. Two, loss of certainty. That's not a bad thing, loss of certainty. It's sometimes a shame that it takes those kinds of things to wake us to it. Life is rarely what we think. What a great stopgap to have active in your loops of thinking all the time. As you said that, I went, damn, how many times a day does life scream that at me? And you know, why suffering exists, Viktor Frankl is a good example. You know, then we get into all kinds of different things. But I want our listeners to see that this is the place where the mystery comes really close. And not just to what we can see with our eyes, but what we feel and see and experience with the wholeness of our being. And I think, Marianne, you know, we've been in conversation for years now, and it's there's so many fine gradations to the experience of loss, and the way different people respond to those experiences. And you bringing it up close invites us to also dare to speak it. And I'll be honest, I don't know how you could go speak all that and not break down. You know, when I just talked about my brother's suicide before the podcast, I could barely talk. And I wonder if it's because you're able to talk about it. And I think Bob shared this piece. You are a hero character in this scenario because you dare to speak it. And when you do that, again, you invite us to maybe realize how healthy it is for us to take our solitary journey and to join it with the human family's journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know, and I think the whole idea of the hero's journey, I mean, because really all of us are heroes in our own lives. And that's what our task is to live who we are. And we talked about this with Dharma, you know, to connect and live who we are. And I wish my life was different than it is, but this is what I have, and this is what I have to work with. And so if nothing else comes through, we do have choices, even when we feel like we don't. And truly, Viktor Frankl changed my life. But
the choice to move forward without, or at least with as little as possible, anger and resentment for other people who haven't suffered as you have, realizing that they have their own suffering, but that you have to move forward in your own life. And again, you're a great testament to the good that you have been able to do, having moved through that grief. You haven't eliminated it, but you have used it to shape your life and your goals in such a way that you have helped many, many people. And I think this talk is going to help many, many more.
Amen.
I hope so, and I think the sorrow is with us forever. It's part of life. It's part of being human. But the pain, we can choose to let go of that, and we can choose to move on from that.
Well, let me ask you a question, Mary Ann, because we've talked about this a little bit, but how has your faith morphed through this experience? I mean, you've talked about your Catholic upbringing and all that, you've even shared how some of this little sayings, if you will, that people have used have lost their value. So how would you talk about your faith morphing through the experience, the different layers of your loss?
I'm so glad you asked that, because that was part of what I left out. I skipped over that in grief counseling. that grief counseling, that one-to-one, helped me with the emotional roller coaster. But when it came to spirituality, I had to learn a new way to understand God, because the religion I was raised with, it was not big enough. It could not hold these experiences. And even if there were kernels of truth in that, I had to find a new way to understand God and life and meaning and purpose. And honestly, Red Hawk, you were instrumental in that part of my journey. And I know I've told you that before, that when we first met, I was in a completely different place than I am now. And that's the idea of community, the idea of others, allowing others in to help us move through what we need to move through. And I never thought I would ever end up back in a church. And if it hadn't been for you, I never would have. And to stop being angry at God and feeling like, oh my God, God is punishing me. I'm being singled out. Because that's kind of the messages I got from Catholicism, that, you're being punished. And that's not the truth. It's not the way it is. And it was a long process to work through that. And so I thank you for helping me through that.
Well, and it's interesting because, I remember our first conversation, you wanted a spiritual director or something, and I said, I don't do that, but I love having coffee with deep thinkers. And we've been having coffee and meeting ever since. And what we've done for each other is we've lifted up the mystery in a way that allows us to swim in it and not being overwhelmed by it. And I think that's part of it. And you've brought that to me, Mary Ann, Mutual Admiration Society here. But that's an important piece, because, this part of life and self-awareness really sucks. There's a few animals that grieve other than humans. Whales grieve. There are some. But when one of my dogs died, and they'd been together their whole lives, the other one, didn't seem to care. There's something about self-awareness, and I go back to the Garden of Eden, which is just an ancient story of how the hell did this happen? We became aware because we ate off the tree that we realized we died. And what killed us was bad. So if you see a snake, kill it. They taste like chicken. That was supposed to be a joke. the whole concept of how we accommodate and assimilate loss, you show us how we take this really shitty stuff of life and learn to spread it on the garden in a way that creates more life and is not, like you said, you can wallow in it. You can be angry and full of self-pity and all these, or you can realize that there's energy in their loss, and it can feed something that maybe you never thought you would have to feed, or that maybe needed feeding. And I think that's part of what your experiences bring to me is, the light is great, but the real growing starts in the dark. And that sucks, but
yeah.
So
I think that, I was just going to say, I think that there's also this bittersweetness to all of this, because there's this idea that our sorrow is an aberration, and I don't know that it is. I think it's part of the richness of the human experience, and I've had to come to that because it's been such a part of my life, and so I don't want to invalidate it. Some people try to happy dance grief and bright side it, and it's like, no, it's not. It is sorrowful. It is hard. But somebody once told me we can do hard things, right? And so, yeah, I don't know.
Amen. And I hate to say it, but we're coming to the end of our time. Bob, I'll give you first crack at final comments.
Well, I feel unworthy to have final comments, but real quickly, living in Florida, we've just gone through a pretty devastating natural disaster down here. And it makes it very, very apparent that life is fragile and that we don't know what's going to come tomorrow. Literally, I'm sitting here today in relative comfort because the storm wasn't 30 miles further north. That close. And the people that were right in the direct trajectory of that storm are suffering today. And life is just not going to ever stop surprising us. And some of those surprises are going to be happy surprises, and a lot of those surprises are going to bring on grief. But again, we got to keep moving no matter what. So, I don't know. Yay for you, Marianne.
Marianne, final comments?
Well, I just want to thank you guys both, because honestly, yay for me because of this connection and because of all of us. I mean, I really believe we're all in this together, and I just want to thank you for listening and giving me the opportunity to be able to share some of what I'm going to say. I hope I don't forget the other parts on Saturday, but
wow.
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, and I have to just return the thanks, because you shared a very intimate part of your life and a part that has been, an organizing center in your life, if you will, that drew together a lot of forces and also drew you to an honesty with the mystery, if you will. And I think that that's important, because one of the things you said is it really helped you live in what is and not what you just want to think it is. And I think that that's important. And as you were talking, I thought about living with what is, you have to get to acceptance. And then once you get to acceptance, you have to be willing to offer your own creativity to that moment. And that moment allows growth. And I think that's the journey that is prevalent in my consciousness after your talk. But it also leads us to this place of the land of is. How do you get there? And I think of, you mentioned Ram Dass. The first book that changed my life after having a hell of an LSD trip, and I mean hell in the real sense of the word. Someone the next day said, you need to read this book, and put it in my lap. I was sitting in a chair, and it was Be Here Now. How do we be here now? How do we get rid of the stuff that's extraneous and stay with the real, the sincere, that piece of life that is truly not just who we are, but who life is, of which we're an iteration. My God, that is part of the journey and so important. My friends, blessing. And in your loss, more blessings. Until next podcast.